The first time I saw the house, I knew something was wrong. Not the obvious kind of wrong that comes with broken windows or peeling paint, but something deeper, something that made my skin crawl the moment I stepped out of my car. The house at 1347 Elm Street had been calling to me for weeks through real estate listings. Its price so impossibly low that I convinced myself it had to be a mistake. Have you ever felt like you were being watched by a building? I know that sounds insane, but standing there on that cracked sidewalk, staring up at the Victorian monstrosity that would soon become my nightmare, I swear the house was staring back at me. The windows, dark and empty as dead eyes, seemed to track my movement as I approached the front porch. Let me give you some context about what led me to this moment, because what I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about the supernatural. Over the next few videos, I'm going to take you through the most terrifying 6 months of my life, documenting every unexplained event, every chilling discovery, and every moment that made me question my sanity. But first, let me prove to you that this isn't just another ghost story. I'm Sarah Chen, and I've spent the last 8 years as a professional paranormal investigator. I've been inside the Amityville house, spent nights in the Tower of London, and investigated over 200 reportedly haunted locations across 3 continents. I've seen things that would make most people never sleep again, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered at 1347 Elm Street. The house had been on the market for 3 years. 3 years. In a neighbourhood where properties sold within weeks, this place sat empty, its price dropping every few months like a stone thrown into a bottomless well. The listing agent, a nervous woman named Patricia who refused to meet me at the property, handed me the keys at a coffee shop downtown and practically threw them across the table. When I asked her why the house hadn't sold, she just shook her head and muttered something about the previous owners leaving in the middle of the night. She wouldn't elaborate, wouldn't even make eye contact when I pressed for details. All she would say was that the house came with a complete history of ownership records, and that I should read them carefully before making any decisions that should have been my first warning. The ownership records told a story that made my investigator instinct scream with excitement and dread in equal measure. The house was built in 1887 by a man named Edmund Blackwood, a wealthy industrialist who made his fortune in the steel business. Edmund lived in the house for exactly 13 months before he was found dead in the basement, his body positioned in what the police report described as an unnatural arrangement that suggested ritualistic elements. The house passed to his brother Thomas, who lasted 8 months before disappearing entirely. His wife claimed he had simply vanished from their bedroom one night, leaving behind all his belongings and no trace of where he might have gone. The police investigated but found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, nothing to suggest what had happened to Thomas Blackwood. Every subsequent owner had a similar story. The Hendersons bought the house in 1923 and fled after 6 months, claiming the house was trying to drive them insane. The Kowalski family purchased it in 1945 and abandoned it after their youngest daughter was found speaking to someone who wasn't there, having full conversations with an invisible presence that seemed to know intimate details about their family history. In 1967, the Morrison family lasted exactly 93 days. The father, a practical man who worked as an engineer, documented his experiences in a journal that was left behind when they moved out. His entries started normal, discussing renovation plans and neighbourhood observations, but quickly devolved into paranoid ramblings about voices in the walls and shadows that moved independently of their sources. The pattern continued through the decades. The longest any family had lived in the house was 14 months, and most didn't make it past 6. Some left in the middle of the night, abandoning their possessions. Others simply disappeared, leaving behind mysteries that local police had long since stopped investigating with any real enthusiasm. But here's what made this case different from every other haunted house investigation I'd ever conducted. The house didn't just drive people away, it seemed to be collecting something from each family that lived there, learning from them, growing stronger with each new set of victims. I discovered this when I found the basement. The real estate listing mentioned a basement, but it failed to mention that the basement was larger than the footprint of the house itself, much larger. The stone walls extended far beyond what should have been possible, creating a labyrinthine network of chambers that seemed to have been carved directly into the bedrock beneath Elm Street. In the first chamber, I found personal belongings from every family that had ever lived in the house. Not just random objects they'd left behind, but specific, meaningful items. Wedding rings, family photographs, children's favourite toys, handwritten letters between spouses. These weren't things people would have abandoned voluntarily. These were treasures, the kinds of possessions that families would risk their lives to retrieve, but they were arranged in a specific pattern. Organised by family and displayed like trophies in some twisted museum. Each family's collection was carefully curated, as if someone or something had selected the most emotionally significant items from their lives and preserved them as mementos. The second chamber contained journals, dozens of them written by previous occupants of the house documenting their experiences in meticulous detail. Reading through these accounts was like watching the same nightmare play out over and over again, with slight variations but always ending the same way: fear, confusion, desperation, and finally, flight. But the third chamber was what convinced me that this house was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. The walls were covered in photographs, thousands of them, showing the families who had lived in the house. But these weren't normal family photos. These were candid shots taken without the subject's knowledge, capturing private moments, intimate conversations, children playing alone in their rooms. Someone or something had been watching these families, documenting their lives with an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on worship. And at the centre of the wall, in a place of obvious importance, was an empty frame, waiting for the next family's collection to begin. That's when I realised I wasn't just investigating a haunted house. I was investigating something that had been actively hunting families for over a century. Something that had turned 1347 Elm Street into a trap designed to lure in unsuspecting victims and feed off their fear, their memories, their very essence. The house wasn't just haunted, it was hungry, and I had just walked directly into its web. What happened next would test everything I thought I knew about the paranormal, about the nature of evil itself, and about how far I was willing to go to uncover the truth. The investigation that followed would take me to the darkest corners of human history, force me to confront entities that existed beyond the boundaries of our reality, and ultimately change me in ways I'm still trying to understand. But that's a story for the next part of this series, because what I discovered in those basement chambers was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume the next 6 months of my life and nearly destroy my sanity in the process. Standing in that basement, surrounded by decades of stolen memories, I made a decision that would haunt me for months to come. I decided to stay not just for a night or a weekend investigation like I usually did, but to actually move into 1347 Elm Street and document whatever was happening there from the inside. My colleagues thought I had lost my mind. Dr. Martinez from the Paranormal Research Institute called me personally to try to talk me out of it. He'd read my preliminary report about the basement chambers, and his voice was shaking when he told me that some investigations weren't worth the risk. But I couldn't let it go. This house represented everything I'd been searching for in my career, the kind of evidence that could change how we understand the supernatural forever. The moving process itself should have been another warning. Every moving company I contacted found excuses not to take the job once I gave them the address. The first company's representative hung up on me mid-conversation when I mentioned Elm Street. The second company showed up, took one look at the house, and drove away without explanation. I finally had to move my belongings myself, making multiple trips in my car while the house seemed to watch my every movement. My first night in the house was deceptively quiet. I'd set up my equipment in what used to be the living room, positioning cameras in every corner, installing motion sensors throughout the first floor, and placing electromagnetic field detectors in strategic locations. The readings were normal, almost disappointingly so. Part of me began to wonder if the house's reputation was just the result of mass hysteria and coincidental circumstances. That illusion lasted exactly 8 hours and 37 minutes. I was reviewing footage from my basement cameras when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In one of the chambers, the empty picture frame I'd discovered was no longer empty. It now contained a photograph of me, taken from an angle that should have been impossible given the camera positions in the room. But more disturbing than the photograph itself was what I was doing in it. The image showed me sleeping in my bed upstairs, but I was awake and reviewing footage. I was in two places at once, and somehow the house had captured both versions of me. When I ran upstairs to check my bedroom, my bed was perfectly made, exactly as I'd left it hours earlier. I hadn't been sleeping, but the photograph showed clear evidence that somehow, somewhere, another version of me was. This was my introduction to what I would later understand as the house's primary method of torment. It didn't just scare its victims with moving objects or strange sounds, it created alternate versions of their reality, showing them things that couldn't be true but were documented with photographic evidence. The psychological impact was devastating because it made you question not just what was happening, but what was real at all. Over the following days, more photographs appeared in that frame. Me having conversations with people who weren't there. Me writing in journals I'd never touched, me exploring parts of the basement that I was certain I'd never visited. Each image was more impossible than the last, and each one chipped away at my confidence in my own memory and perception. The voices started on my fourth night in the house. Not the typical ghostly whispers or disembodied calls that I'd encountered in other investigations. These voices were having conversations about me, discussing my habits, my fears, my past experiences. They spoke as if I weren't there, analysing me like scientists studying a laboratory specimen. They knew things about my childhood that I'd never told anyone. They discussed the recurring nightmare I'd had since I was 7 years old, the one about drowning in dark water while something watched from below. They talked about my relationship with my sister, mentioning arguments we'd had in private and insecurities I'd never voiced aloud. But most disturbing of all, they seemed to be planning something. The conversations had the tone of preparation, as if they were deciding how best to add me to their collection. They debated which of my possessions would be most meaningful to preserve, which photographs would best capture my essence, which memories would provide the most nourishment. Because that's what I was beginning to understand about the house. It didn't just collect objects and photographs, it fed on human experiences, consuming the emotional energy attached to our most precious memories and relationships. The families who had lived there weren't just driven away by supernatural activity. They were being systematically harvested, their life force slowly drained until they had no choice but to flee or risk losing themselves entirely. The house was a parasite, and I was its latest host. My equipment began malfunctioning on the 7th day. Not all at once, which would have been suspicious, but gradually, in ways that seemed like natural technical failures, cameras would lose focus at crucial moments. Audio recordings would develop static exactly when the voices were speaking. Motion sensors would trigger randomly, training me to ignore them just before something genuinely significant would occur. It was psychological warfare conducted with supernatural precision, designed to isolate me from my tools and methods, leaving me dependent on my increasingly unreliable senses. The house was teaching me that I couldn't trust my equipment, couldn't trust my perception, couldn't trust anything except the growing certainty that I was in serious danger. But I was also getting closer to understanding what the house actually was. Through careful analysis of the journals left by previous occupants, I began to see patterns that suggested the entity inhabiting 1347 Elm Street wasn't a traditional ghost or demon. It was something far older and more complex, something that had learned to manipulate reality itself through decades of feeding on human consciousness. The breakthrough came when I discovered Edmund Blackwood's personal study, hidden behind a false wall in what appeared to be a closet. Inside I found his private journals, and they told a story that explained everything I'd been experiencing. Blackwood hadn't been a victim of the house. He had been its creator. In 1886, Edmund Blackwood made a discovery that would damn every soul who entered his future home. while excavating the foundation for what would become 1347 Elm Street. His workers unearthed something that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries. His journal entries from that period describe finding a series of stone chambers filled with symbols that hurt to look at directly, carvings that seem to shift and change when observed from different angles, but Edmund didn't seal up his discovery and build elsewhere like any rational person would have done. Instead, he became obsessed with what he called the sleeping presence beneath the ground. His journal entries grew increasingly erratic as he documented his experiments with what he believed was an ancient form of consciousness that existed between dimensions. The symbols weren't just decorations, they were instructions, a manual for creating what Edmund termed a consciousness trap. The entity beneath the ground wasn't malevolent by nature, but it was hungry in a way that transcended physical need. It fed on awareness itself, on the spark of consciousness that makes humans more than just biological machines. Edmund spent months translating the symbols, learning to communicate with the presence through dreams and meditation. The entity promised him knowledge beyond human understanding, the secrets of life and death, the ability to transcend mortality itself. All it asked in return was a steady supply of conscious minds to sustain its existence in our reality. The house was never meant to be a home. It was designed as a feeding mechanism, every room positioned according to principles that Edmund had learned from the symbols. The layout created a subtle psychological pressure that would gradually break down the mental defenses of anyone who lived there. The basement chambers weren't just storage areas. They were part of an elaborate system designed to channel human consciousness directly to the entity that dwelled beneath. Edmund's final journal entries revealed the true horror of what he had unleashed. The entity didn't just consume consciousness, it preserved it. Every mind it had fed upon remained aware, trapped in a state of eternal observation, while the creature used their memories and experiences to better understand and manipulate future victims. The families who had lived in the house weren't just gone. They were still there, their consciousness absorbed into something that grew more sophisticated with each new addition. Reading Edmund's account, I finally understood why the photographs in the basement showed impossible scenes. The entity was using the preserved consciousness of previous victims to create alternate versions of reality, showing current occupants glimpses of what their lives could become if they surrendered to its influence. It wasn't just psychological torture, it was recruitment. The voices I had been hearing weren't ghosts or demons. They were the remnants of human minds that had been consumed by the entity, forced to participate in the process of luring new victims into the trap. They retained enough of their original personality to seem human, but they were no longer capable of independent thought or action. They existed solely to serve the creature's hunger. Edmund's transformation had taken 13 months because he had willingly participated in the process. Unlike the families who would come after him, he understood what was happening and chose to feed himself to the entity in exchange for the promise of eternal consciousness. His death in the basement hadn't been murder or suicide. It had been a willing sacrifice to complete the binding ritual that would anchor the creature permanently to our reality. But something had gone wrong with Edmund's plan. The entity had consumed his consciousness as promised, but it had also inherited his human limitations and desires. Instead of the pure, efficient feeding mechanism he had envisioned, the creature had become something more complex and unstable. It craved not just consciousness, but the specific flavors of human emotion and experience that came with it. This explained why the house's methods had evolved over the decades. Each family had taught it something new about human psychology, and it had adapted its techniques accordingly. The Hendersons had shown it the power of fear, so it learned to amplify anxiety and paranoia. The Kowalski family had demonstrated how attachment to children could be weaponized, so it developed methods for targeting the youngest family members first. By the time I arrived, the entity had become a master manipulator with over a century of experience in breaking human minds. It understood exactly which psychological buttons to push, which fears to exploit, which hopes to corrupt. It had been preparing for me specifically, studying my background and psychological profile from the moment I first viewed the house listing the real estate agent. Patricia hadn't been trying to help me by providing the ownership records. She had been working for the entity, whether she knew it or not. The creature had learned that certain types of people were more valuable than others, and paranormal investigators represented a particularly rich source of consciousness. Our minds were already open to possibilities beyond normal reality, making us easier to manipulate and ultimately consume. Everything that had happened since I entered the house had been choreographed with precision. The gradual equipment failures, the impossible photographs, the voices discussing my private life, all of it was designed to isolate me and make me dependent on the entity for validation of my own reality. It was the same process Edmund had undergone, but refined through decades of practice. The creature wasn't just feeding on my consciousness, it was trying to convince me to surrender it willingly. The photographs showing alternate versions of my life weren't threats, they were temptations. They showed me what I could become if I stopped fighting and allowed myself to be absorbed into the collective consciousness that now inhabited the house. Standing in Edmund's hidden study, surrounded by his journals and research notes, I realized that I was facing a choice that every previous occupant had eventually confronted. I could flee like the families before me, leaving behind whatever pieces of my consciousness the entity had already claimed, or I could try to fight something that had been growing stronger for over a century. But there was a third option that Edmund's journals hinted at but never fully explained. The binding ritual that had anchored the entity to our reality could theoretically be reversed, but only by someone who understood both the original symbols and the modifications that had been made over the decades. The creature's evolution had created weaknesses that hadn't existed when Edmund first summoned it. What I discovered in that hidden study changed everything I thought I knew about 1347 Elm Street, but it was only the beginning of a battle that would push me to the very edges of sanity. The entity that had been feeding on human consciousness for over a century wasn't invincible, but destroying it would require me to risk everything I was to save everyone who might come after. In the next video, I'll show you the ancient ritual I attempted, the horrifying price I paid for that knowledge, and whether anyone can truly escape the hunger that still dwells beneath Elm Street. Some houses should never be entered, but once you're inside, the only way out might be through the very darkness that's trying to consume you.